My name is Matthew Taylor, and welcome to our first Bush Broadcast Deep Dive webinar for 2025. Our deep dives are where we chat one-on-one with one of the Bush Heritage team to explore a particular topic. Now, I'm here today in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They're the traditional custodians of this country I'm on today, and they've lived and worked here, hunting and fishing the land and waters around Sydney for tens of thousands of years. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that you're standing on right now, wherever you are joining us from around the country. Aboriginal people have looked after country since the Dreamtime and continue to do so. So I'd like to thank the Gadigal people for having me on their country today for this webinar and for the opportunity Bush Heritage has to work with traditional custodians across Australia, looking after the wonderful landscapes, wildlife and culture that makes for healthy country. As always, you can use the chat function at the bottom of the screen or the Q&A, whichever is your preference, to say good day and let us know where you're calling from. And feel free to use either of those channels to post any questions that come up for you. So that's the chat or the Q&A button. You can do that at any time during the webinar, and we'll get to these questions at the end. Okay, well, as you may know, we've been incredibly fortunate to acquire 4 new properties in the past 18 months. And that's been thanks to the phenomenal contribution of our supporters. We've been able to purchase Evelyn Downs in South Australia, our biggest ever property, Sandstrom in Victoria, Dodgy Downs, that's a great name, in WA, and Nil Desperandum in New South Wales. And this has lifted our reserve network to nearly 1.5 million hectares, which you can see on the slide here is the green line that's got us up to 1.5 on the right there. It's been a great step towards achieving our 2030 strategy, which is to deepen and double our impact, which means we're aiming to expand the amount of land we own to 2.4 million hectares by 2030, and to significantly increase the conservation innovation programme to enable depth of impact across the landscapes we already measure. So only 900,000 hectares to go. How do we do that? Well, in an ideal world, we'd be able to purchase every property that has high conservation values that came our way. But money's not limitless. And as anyone who's tried to buy a property knows, finding the right place at the right price, which the owner actually wants to sell, is never easy. And the path to settlement can be long and arduous. So how does Bush Heritage go about finding, selecting, assessing, and acquiring properties? That's what we're exploring today. And to find out, I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Rebecca Spindler, who is our Executive Manager of Science and Conservation. Hi, Beck.
Hello, Matthew. How lovely to see you. Hi, everyone.
And where are you calling us from today, Beck?
Thanks, Matthew. I'm coming in today from Port Stephens, Warramai country, and recognise and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging across this area and recognise their enduring connection to country. And hello to everyone who was also woken up at 3 a.m. with the earth shaking quite literally this morning.
Yes, an earthquake. And much to my chagrin, I slept through it. I have a great ambition of experiencing an earthquake, but yet again, I slept through it in Sydney. So anyway, amongst the many areas of land in our geologically stable country, as it usually is, there's amazing biodiversity and ecological values, and so many properties that Bush Heritage could purchase to protect. The first step is we've got to prioritise where we're needed most, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a key point, I think, to sort of dwell on for just a minute around how we telegraph to people where we want to work and how we want to work. Bush Heritage is incredibly collaborative. We really try and work with as many people as we possibly can. And one of the really important edicts of that is recognising the mosaic of approaches. So we have our approach at AWC, national parks, various other agencies that we might be working in partnership, traditional custodians, agencies that we might be working in partnership across particular landscapes all have different approaches. Some of them are based on geography, some of them are based on species, some of them are based on different ecology. So I'm just going to preface, I might fall into some language where I talk about certainly priorities. I might even talk about important landscapes. I think it's really important to recognise that I recognise every landscape is important. every landscape has an ecological context that is important and certainly has a cultural context that is important. When I talk about important, I'm talking about areas that are best fit for bush heritage. And that's really important to have everybody understand what we've prioritised, and then they figure out how that we can all work together. So that's where we've come up with the priority landscapes, which were actually established by my predecessor in 1996. And they were really looking at the IBRA subregions, which are a national system of looking at all of the different ecosystem types across Australia and how much of that land was reserved, put into the national reserve system, whether that's public or private protected area. And we prioritised those IBRA subregions, the International Biodiversity Regional Assessment, of which of those areas are least protected, least represented in the National Reserve System. And that's where we started to prioritise really where we were working and where we could really provide the greatest support in terms of the expansion of the National Reserve System as well as implementation. We then started looking much more at individual ecosystems, so looking certainly at ecosystems that are underrepresented in the National Reserve System, but also ecosystems that were diminishing and threatened, making sure that we were picking up those ecosystems that most needed that level of protection and that expansion inclusion in the National Reserve System. We've started bringing in a lot more climate change analysis and assessment to understand where we are looking at ecosystems that are likely to remain relatively stable over the coming decades, and ecosystems that also, or landscape features that coincide with the ecosystems we care about, that hold biodiversity, that have climate refugia, whether that's maintaining temperature or holding on to moisture, which really the adage of just add water and there's life is very much true across so much of Australia, the driest continent apart from Antarctica. So understanding where those areas are that will provide life, that will maintain biodiversity, making sure that doesn't get converted into non-contributing land uses like some kinds of agriculture and some kinds of mining that would really deplete the country of having those important areas. We then started looking in 2021 at very much more a deeper understanding of how we could invest responsibly. We wanted to reduce some of the risk of our investments across the priority landscapes, but also be really clear about where we were going to need that innovation that you talked about, Matthew, to be very sure that we were maintaining the health of that biodiversity for generations to come. What were the things that we really needed to dig in and invest in? So the different priority landscapes have been separated into 3 different categories based on that climate mapping. And we have to say a vote of thanks to CSIRO, both the Climate Science Centre and the Land and Water Division, who've provided us terabytes of data around the basic impact of climate in terms of precipitation, temperature changes, all of those sorts of fundamental meteorological impacts, but then also the land and water for using some of their models to understand particularly the impact on vascular plants of those meteorological changes over decades so that we understood, because as you know, our vision is healthy country protected forever. We've taken that very seriously. How do we really take that very long-term look as well as an expansive geographic look at how we protect Australia?
So tell us, sorry, were you continuing? Or?
No, you go.
I was going to ask you, I know it's been a very intensive process. The 3 categories that came up on the map there, I'm imagining you're going to lead us into an explanation of what they are and the differences between them.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Matthew. So just to dwell a little bit on the resilient landscapes, this is actually the majority of our landscapes are still fitting into that resilient landscape. And these are landscapes that either we feel confident are going to remain relatively stable. So where we invest, either in an acquisition or a partnership here, we're confident we know what we're facing for decades into the future, or the confidence around a lot of the climate models is so low, and that's true in many cases across the top of Australia in particular. We just don't know exactly what those changes are going to mean. So we haven't changed here our acquisition of working with partners or acquiring land as reserves across those areas, because we want to be able to protect as much as we possibly can. So you can see each of these different areas. We're really consistently open to large-scale acquisition, knowing that we will need to have a strong investment not only in the purchase of the land, but an entire reserve staff, which is generally an area manager, a reserve manager, an ecologist, an Aboriginal partnership manager. It's a significant long-term investment as well as on top of the acquisition. But each of these different landscapes in almost every state except Victoria has been designated as open to those large scale acquisitions or partnership, particularly with Aboriginal people. If we think then about the next category, the reconnection category, that's really looking at where we have probably fragmented landscapes. The resilient landscapes also have a preponderance of highly intact areas, areas that are primary habitat and have not been overly disturbed, although there's very few places in Australia that have not been touched. But the reconnection landscapes are areas that have generally been desirable for been clearing for agriculture, or they've been converted into other land uses. What we've been able to determine is that these particular areas, and the Southwest WA is a perfect example, it's a biodiversity hotspot. It's a globally recognised biodiversity hotspot, and the diversity in this area the floristic diversity is absolutely incredible. It's the only place in the world where mammal pollinators have and really could have evolved because of the diversity of flowering. There's always something flowering to keep those pollinators alive and thriving. Because it's a very human thing to walk into a landscape, a habitat like that, and go, wow, this is incredibly abundant. This is going to be fantastic. I'm going to try and, knock it down and grow something productive across this area. It's taken us a long time to figure out that diversity actually comes from hardship. It's a very high rainfall. The soils are depauperate. I used to say that it was an insult to call this stuff soil because it looks very much like sand to me, but I think that's not quite true. It is so much richness of a completely different level, but it's very hard to grow productive crops across this area. So we're able to pick up farms that aren't particularly productive and restore so much of that biodiversity. And we do use carbon contracts to provide diverse funding to build this in, but we go so much further than the carbon contract, planting and generating thousands and thousands of species across these areas. We plant an enormous diversity of species to begin with, but then by bringing those ecosystems, that attracts the birds, and the birds then bring more seeds. So what we're able to do then, and again, using the Southwest WA as an example, generating those stepping stones and those pathways between the Fitzgerald River and the Stirling National Park, we can actually provide a bit of a highway for biodiversity to restore themselves back to that natural habitat, but also bring all of the resources that they bring and undertake their natural services that they provide to the entire ecosystem. We have a number of those landscapes, as you've seen, particularly across New South Wales and a little bit up to Queensland, where we're really trying to restore connection between landscapes and connection between people and landscapes. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next section. But if we just skip into the strengthened landscapes in particular, these are the landscapes where we have reasonably good evidence that we're going to see a significant amount of change. And whatever investment we make in these areas, we're going to have to invest not only, again, in the acquisition of land, but really innovative management to make sure we understand the things that are critical to protect in place, and that we've got the tools to be able to protect those things, the things that must stay there because of they're either ecologically driving health and function across that landscape, or they're culturally critically important. How do we really make sure that those things are going to be viable and the ecosystem is going to remain functional for generations into the future, even if it does change just a little bit. So we've really restricted, we still acquire across these landscapes, and you'll see examples of that, where we're really strengthening our existing investments and acquiring landscapes around that. We work so much at scale. We're just doing that around our landscapes, across these strengthened landscapes, to make sure that we're protecting and providing biodiversity the room to move across that little micro habitat.
So that comes together in that first slide we saw, which is quite big areas of Australia, which that we prioritise, even though there might be wonderful opportunities elsewhere, because we simply do have to prioritise. So, is that the model we're working on now, or does that get further refined?
Where for the last little while, we've had the most amazing spatial analyst, Lucy Rose, come and join us. And thanks to Lucy and her abilities with finding and assimilating data, like you can see up on the screen right now, and you don't need to pay any attention to the detail of these. It just gives you an example of the kind of information we're looking at, which is really looking at identifying the underrepresented, threatened and diminishing ecosystems where there are climate refugia, for us to be able to blend all of that together. And if we can just skip to the next slide, this shows how we're able to blend all of that information together to identify what we're calling focal landscapes. And because, as you say, Matthew, the priority landscapes are still a third of Australia. And so while we have tried prioritising, that in and of itself is not enough detail for us to really focus and identify not only properties, but identify areas where we can have much more meaningful discussions with traditional custodians. So it's really only at the stage of developing those focal landscapes. So you'll see the red outlines are properties, and where there's a cluster of those properties, we will draw a line, and these are all drafts. So Lucy hopefully doesn't mind me throwing this up in the webinar under advisement from our Chief Scientist, Hedley Grantham, really identifying where we want to work within those priority landscapes, providing even more prioritisation and the ability for our Aboriginal partnership managers to have proactive conversations with traditional custodians to understand whether they're interested in partnering, whether they would like to work with bush heritage, whether they see any value to us coming into the landscape. And this gets again back to what you were saying before, Matthew, about it's where we can add the greatest value. There are so many different agencies, so many different wonderful people undertaking conservation on public and private land. We need to make sure that our specific skill set is something that can genuinely improve the conservation value and resilience of those landscapes long term. So you'll just see some slides coming up now that are examples of some of our most beautiful reserves that are in resilient landscapes. And remember, these are largely intact, and we think going to remain relatively stable or healthy for decades to come, without an extraordinary level of innovation. Having said that, climate change will touch everywhere. So even those landscapes in the resilient landscapes, we're having to be extremely aware of and alive to any changes. And we talk obviously with our ecologists across those reserves, but also the reserve managers and the healthy landscape managers and the traditional custodians to say, what are you seeing? What are the changes that you're seeing over time? Are there different types of flowering? Are the migrating birds and the flowering species that they rely on matching, or is there a little mismatch? And we're already hearing from a number of traditional custodians, even across resilient landscapes, that is an issue, and that is something that they're seeing. So we're trying to figure out now about how we really maintain that resilience long term and make sure that we're protecting the conservation values for which we've purchased these properties in the first place. And the reconnection landscapes, obviously, as we've talked a little bit about, take that additional effort to regenerate, to plant trees, to rebuild health across landscapes that may have been grazed, they may have been cropped, they may have been turned into completely different land uses. How do we build back the connection with people, traditional custodians, but also how do we build back the health and the resilience and the call it contiguity. And if you think about it like a piece of material, if you throw a brick at a really nice solid bit of linen that doesn't have any gaps in it, you'll generally be able to catch that brick. If you throw a brick at a piece of lacework, the holes allow the brick to sort of rip through the lacework and fall through the middle. What we're doing is trying to build back that contiguous areas of strong, resilient habitat and remove those gaps, remove those holes. And by doing that, we're really building strength across the entire landscape.
Thank you for explaining. I can see it's an incredibly sophisticated piece of work that has to go in just to help us identify where to look. And I guess part of the reason for doing that is to have our purchasing go from, I think when you and I both joined the organization, it was very much reactive, wasn't it? It was like when things came our way or we were recommended, we would investigate and look at buying a property, and that still occurs today. But what you're describing there is a much more proactive, isn't it? Being on the front foot and actually knowing which property, were it to come up, would fit absolutely in the sweet spot, and even allow us to potentially reach out to owners who might have a property that we'd love to acquire.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Matthew, and we are always going to be at the under the gun in terms of availability. We can design exactly where we would like to invest and where we would like to buy, but we are absolutely really needing to wait for landholders to be ready to sell. It's only when the opportunity arises do we really get to implement some of these. We do try not to go asking people if they're interested in selling their property because that drives prices up for everyone. So we really need to wait for those properties to come up, for landholders to be ready to sell. But most importantly, I think so much of this science, which and I know Lucy's computer is working overtime. Every analysis will take 72 hours for that computer to sort of grind through those incredibly detailed maps of condition and ecosystem type and climate refugia and all of those sorts of things. So we can be absolutely ready, and absolutely ready includes talking to the traditional custodians. If the traditional custodians are actually interested in purchasing that landscape for themselves, we will never compete with that. So we need their collaboration and permission really to go in and investigate the acquisition of any property across Australia.
Indeed. And once the opportunity is with us, I know there's a very sophisticated internal system. The fact that you've done all this work with your team to identify that this landscaping property might be of interest doesn't mean that once it's being offered to us, that it's necessarily the right one, is it? Can you tell us a bit more about what happens the minute we get offered something and we then have to go and do a lot of work to understand the details of that individual property, don't we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So again, working through all of the large scale data that we work with to understand the ecological opportunities and how well represented a particular ecosystem is, we then also really need to understand the opportunity for bush heritage's skill set. As I was saying, where do we fit within the mosaic of conservation approaches, and is this property particularly important for our skill set to engage traditional owners, to genuinely understand the urgency? What is going to happen if Bush Heritage doesn't buy this property? And if the property is likely to remain relatively well protected, either because it has a covenant on it or it's in an inaccessible area that's likely to mean clearing would be very unlikely, we might actually decide to go and invest somewhere else that has a more urgent need for conservation. Otherwise, the landscape might be profoundly changed. We do look at connectivity. We look at a large landscape of connectivity, and we look at what we do best. So we look at fire, ferals, weeds, and water, I think. So really managing fire appropriately wherever we possibly can with traditional custodians. We look at feral animal management and understanding whether removing feral animals is really going to have a conservation step change in terms of protecting what we call conservation targets and achieving our conservation goals. Are weeds an issue across the particular area, and is our skill set, which is absolute dogged determination, reserve managers, area managers, everybody all in, working day after day after day after day to get rid of some of the most pernicious weeds. Is that something that's genuinely going to add conservation value to the broader area? And then finally, obviously, water becoming much more of an issue as we go forward in the decades, knowing that Australia largely is going to dry out. That will make us more fire prone, but the dehydration in and of itself is actually a primary threat. So we need to make sure that our soils are as healthy and ready to accept that water as we possibly can. We cannot have laminated soils where the water is just running off straight off into the nearest waterway. We need to be ready to absorb that water and bring that life, bring that green flush that is so much a part of the Australian boom-bust cycle. It's only by being as ready as we possibly can when those rains do come that we're able to have that cycle and things really do rebound. It can look quite dry and a bit sad every now and then, particularly with a drought like the millennial drought that lasted 8 or 9 years. But it's only when the rains come that we get a scorecard and we see how many of the native seed stock are still in that landscape, as opposed to some of the weeds that might have come in. And it's always a glory to see the green flushes and the beautiful landscapes come back to life as soon as we get water into them.
Well, that's wonderful. And then we're set up to actually go into negotiation and hopefully acquire the property and move us along our pathway towards our goals of deepening and doubling. We've had some fantastic questions coming in, Beck. So I'd like to move to those now. A wonderful question from Peter Sainsbury, which is, I've always wondered this one. The Kimberley and Western Deserts resilient landscapes and Mulligan appear to stop at the Northern Territory border, as if the landscape itself gives up when it gets to NT. So I think the question is, there's probably a rationale behind that. Can you enlighten us why that looks like the boundary between the states?
Yeah, amazingly enough, when you're walking across the boundary between Western Australia and Northern Territory, the landscape doesn't actually change from one landscape to another, from one habitat type to another. But all of the maps would tell you that it does. So partly it's a little bit pragmatic. We are looking at different legislative environments across Western Australia and Northern Territory and Queensland and South Australia and North, because nobody agrees. Nobody wants to agree around the different legislative support for conservation across these different areas. But there is also a difference in the mapping that we are trying to resolve. And actually, we've just received, we've just got our hands on a new data set, which is hoping to assimilate so much of the National Vegetation Information System data sets. It's David Keith from UNSW has been working on a fantastic ecosystem typology and including the National Vegetation Information System data sets so that we can smooth over some of those border generated differences in the data, because so much of NVIS is generated by the individual states and then pulled together. And the team have been doing a wonderful job for many, many years, but trying to smooth over those different state-by-state boundaries remains a problem. It is something that we're trying to get over. So we're working on it.
Wonderful, wonderful. And there's another question from Mary, which was, it looks like there's no priority landscapes on the East Coast, even though they clearly do have critically endangered ecological communities present there. And Mary's question is this because land values are prohibitive and prevent us being able to acquire close to the East Coast, or do we have a minimum size of property that we acquire? Which I thought was a good question to help, unpick that particular element.
Excellent questions, both of them. So I see what you mean in terms of being very close to the coast. We have not previously prioritised coastal areas specifically. They haven't come up in our mapping as being sorry, this is going to be slightly confusing, as being large enough areas to prioritise. And I mean that at the focal landscape level. I don't mean that at the property level. So we certainly have prioritised and acquired properties even less than a hectare if they are adjacent to another protected area, particularly our own reserves, where they have specific habitat that is likely to be devastated if we don't acquire it. So no, there is no minimum area for us to acquire, although we do work at extent. So it's definitely something that we do generally take into account because that's where we work best. So that it hasn't come up in our mapping really to prioritise the coastal areas, partly because a lot of those ecosystems are represented in the National Reserve System, or they are already protected by other members of the conservation estate, the conservation sector, because that's their focal area. And I'm thinking primarily, if you think about the coast of Queensland, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and other organisations might be really prioritising protection of those areas. We largely, unless we enter into partnership, and we actually are talking to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, unless we enter into partnership, we largely leave that to them because they've designated that's their area that they want to work. Brilliant. There's so much for us all to do. Let's really focus on the things that we've identified as our priorities, and then we can work together where they overlap.
Absolutely. And so when you're talking about sort of some of the coastal heaths and some of the temperate woodlands that you get on the East Coast down here in New South Wales, they're very well represented generally, even though we'd love more of them. And I think your point about if we did buy something small on the coast, that would mean someone managing it, and where are they going to live, and do we have one full-time equivalent staff member handling a very small reserve? So it's a useful question to sort of highlight that bit, which is the cost of achieving the impact is part of our decision making as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And where can we have impact at scale? You know, if we have someone looking at a very small property and there's very little opportunity to expand, that's again not really in our bailiwick. We really work at scale.
Well, there's a lovely question about temperate grasslands, which we know are one of the most wonderful habitats and most significantly threatened across Australia. Do we have any of those included in our priority landscapes?
Yes, I would have thought so. I would have thought certainly grassy box woodlands would, and yeah. I'll get there. I think there's certainly large areas of grassland in the properties where we prioritise the grassy box woodlands. We do have significant grasslands in Victoria, and we're actually looking at a couple of properties in Victoria that would have more grassland, and across New South Wales actually. So I think we certainly do have properties that contain considerable proportions of grasslands for sure.
And our Scottsdale Reserve has
deprioritise. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say our Scottsdale Reserve in New South Wales has some wonderful narrow grasslands there. And I don't know whether Mitchell grasslands are considered temperate. They're probably more subtropical, but there's certainly plenty of that up in southern Queensland, aren't there?
Yeah, that's right.
Another question, which does come up quite often, can you explain what we do when we get donations or offers of donations of land outside our priority landscape? Because I know some of our wonderful supporters have their own property or bits of land that they've come their way, and they want to, they hope that Bush Heritage can look after that in perpetuity, once they pass. So it'd be helpful to understand how we deal with those.
Absolutely. And there's a number of donations that certainly have been brought into the Bush Heritage portfolio, which means we are then obligated to take care of that land forever. That taking it into our priority landscapes and our portfolio is a significant investment. So every donation of land goes through exactly the same process as it would if we were looking to acquire that land and having to pay for it. As I say, a number of times we have absolutely brought those properties into the portfolio, even if they're outside of the priority landscape, because there's something in the mapping that we've missed. and this property really does provide us a significant opportunity to care for unique conservation or cultural values. If we decide not to, we talk with the people who are interested in donating that landscape and let them know that we'll certainly covenant that property to make sure that it's protected in perpetuity wherever that's available to us to do. And then we would sell that property and put the proceeds back into our conservation work across Australia. And then, of course, it's certainly up to the donor to remove that that offer and go and undertake different action with that land.
Our approach is certainly to have open and honest discussions, isn't it, about just how much we can help with that. And if we're not able to and it doesn't fit, then there are lots of other organisations who can help, as you say, with the covenanting. So we can usually find a pathway for the person to achieve what they want, even if it's not something we can help at that particular time. Well, it looks like we're running out of time, Beck. There was one last question which said, who do we contact if we want to donate a property? So please get in touch with us on our team in Melbourne, or you can contact me. I'll ask Megan to put some contact details in the chat just before we finish. We're always delighted to talk to people if they do have property that they think is of importance. And thanks again to everybody who joined us. And I love the fact that we have experts online. So some of the questions and even some of our answers are being corrected as we speak in terms of what constitutes grasslands. And I thought I was probably misdescribing Mitchell grass woodlands as temperate. They are indeed subtropical. So thanks, David, for that correction. Always lovely to have the panel of experts all contributing to this. Well, I think this has been a fascinating deep dive into one of the most complex elements of what Bush Heritage does. So thanks for joining us today, Beck, to bring light into that area. And hopefully we will be continuing to use this ever more refined process to identify the next big acquisitions that will be exciting us and forming parts of our communications and appeals to our wonderful supporters who've helped us so much this year in some of those great acquisitions. And I would like to just do a last thank you, Beck, for contributing so widely to these webinars over the course of time, and wish you well on your future travels as you head off around the world for quite a few months. So it's been glorious having you steer the Bush Heritage ship for so long and help us towards those wonderful acquisitions. And I hope you see some wonderful bits of the world elsewhere on your travels.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's been an absolute joy. Bush Heritage is well and truly my favourite job, and I've been very lucky in my career. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Look forward to seeing you again. We have a winter webinar coming up, a full-length winter webinar on June the 11th. Location to be determined. It's a secret. We're working on it as we speak. Look forward to joining you at that one. You'll get an invitation soon. And thanks to our producer, Megan, for putting together yet another wonderful webinar. Thanks and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.